The deputy folded the paper instead of reading it aloud. He had ridden out from the claim office to deliver a debt notice, but the man he had come for was standing beside a hole in frozen ground, and a shovel blade was still ringing where it had struck clay. Two children stood close, a boy holding a tin cup of something white and solid, a girl rubbing her mitten across a cracked stove lid someone had carried from a wagon. The coffin boards were fresh, wrapped in newspaper, and the nails had not yet been driven. Wind caught the deputy's coat. He looked at the paper in his hand, then at the line written at the bottom, payment due before first thaw, and he could not make himself speak. Orrin Vale reached Broken Kettle on the 9th of October, 1887, with two children in the wagon bed, a cracked sheet iron stove lashed to the tailgate, and $11.40 folded inside a tobacco tin his dead wife had used for sewing needles. Clara had died 9 days earlier. Lung fever. She had coughed through the last 60 miles of trail, and when the coughing stopped, Orrin pulled the wagon into a stand of cottonwood near a stage road and dug the grave with a shovel meant for turning garden soil. Milo, 9 years old, held a tin cup of milk that had frozen during the night. Tessa, 6, kept rubbing her mitten across the cracked lid of the stove as though she could warm it back to life. The undertaker's assistant from a road station 3 miles east charged $4 for coffin boards and asked who would sign for them. Orrin signed. The ink froze on the page before it dried. He had meant to winter with a cousin near Yankton. The cousin's farm had been sold. The letter promising shelter was 6 months old and addressed to a house that no longer existed. Orrin learned this from a freight clerk who remembered the sale. The clerk also remembered that the cousin had gone to Montana, or possibly Oregon, and owed money to 3 men in town. So Orrin drove north because a man he had worked with in a hide camp 2 years earlier had mentioned a claim near the James River Valley, abandoned, cheap, maybe free if a person was willing to sign the company's terms. The man's name was Dalton, and Dalton was dead now too, kicked in the chest by a mule in Sioux Falls. But the claim existed. It was listed with a land agent named Ephraim Rusk in Broken Kettle, and Rusk confirmed by letter that the shanty still stood and the filing fee had lapsed. Orrin had no relatives within 500 miles. He had no team strong enough to pull the wagon back south before freeze-up. He had 2 children who could not travel in deep cold, a wife buried beside a road they would never use again, and a tobacco tin with $11.40. Broken Kettle was not a town. It was a scattering of plank buildings along a mud track 17 miles from a rail spur and 6 miles from the nearest timber claim. A store, a claim office, a blacksmith who also pulled teeth, and 14 homesteads spread across the drainage of a creek that ran brown in spring and dry by August. The settlement sat in open prairie. Wind came from every direction and had nothing to break against except the buildings themselves. Rusk met Orrin at the claim office and handed him a paper. The shanty was 12 by 16 feet, plank board walls, no proper chinking, a roof patched with tar paper already peeling at the seams. The boards were green pine, cut wet the previous summer, and warped after drying unevenly. Half-inch gaps ran between nearly every plank where the wood had cupped away from its neighbor. The door hung on leather hinges. The single window was a square hole with a flour sack curtain nailed across it. Rusk said the land reverted to the company if Orrin left before spring. He also noted that Orrin owed $28 on the stove, purchased on credit from a dealer in Vermilion who had forwarded the note, and $9 for Clara's coffin boards. Rusk was not unkind. He simply read the numbers and let them do their work. Orrin set the stove inside the shanty that afternoon. He lit a fire with cottonwood splits. Within 20 minutes, the room had warmed enough to unbutton a coat. Within 40 minutes, the fire had burned to coals, and the room was cold again. He held a candle near the west wall and watched the flame lean sideways, bending toward the gaps as though the wall were breathing. Every seam pulled air. The stove did not heat the room. It heated the wind passing through it. That night, Milo and Tessa slept in the wagon bed under every blanket they owned. Orrin sat on the shanty floor with the stove door open, feeding sticks into the fire, watching the walls leak heat into the dark. He had less than 2 cords of wood stacked against the south side. In a tight cabin, a real cabin, with daubed logs and a sealed roof, 2 cords might stretch 3 weeks if a man burned carefully. In the shanty, 2 cords would last 10 days, maybe 12 if he let the fire die between midnight and dawn. But letting the fire die meant the children woke in a room where their breath froze on the blanket edge, and Tessa's feet were already cold enough that she cried without knowing why. 3 days after Orrin's arrival, Anson Teague came to look at the shanty. Teague was 61, a former Army carpenter who had built officers' quarters at Fort Sisseton and stockade walls at 3 other posts before his knees gave out, and he settled on a homestead near Broken Kettle. He was the man people asked when a roof sagged or a door would not close. He had opinions, and the opinions were usually correct, and he delivered them with the blunt economy of a man who had built things for 40 years and watched most of them fail. He walked the perimeter of the shanty without speaking. He pressed his palm flat against the west wall and held it there. He looked at the roof seams. He crouched and studied the sill where the bottom boards met the frozen ground. Then he stood and brushed dirt from his knees and looked at Orrin the way a doctor looks at a wound he cannot stitch. "This is not a cabin," Teague said. "This is lumber standing upright." Orrin said nothing. Teague told him the honest cure: new battens nailed over every seam, felt paper beneath them, lime daubing in the worst gaps, 3 men working 2 full days. He listed the cost the way a man reads a bill of sale: $8 in nails and battens, $4 in felt paper, 2 wagon loads of clay if the ground thawed enough to dig, and at least 6 cords of cut wood to carry the winter even after the walls were sealed. "You have maybe 1.5 cords out there," Teague said. "You need 6 minimum. You have no battens, no felt, no nails to spare, no clay, and no men. You have a cracked stove in a box that leaks from every direction." Orrin asked what would happen if he tried to winter in the shanty as it stood. Teague looked at the children. Milo was stacking kindling chips he had gathered from behind the store, arranging them in a pile he could carry in both arms. Tessa sat on the wagon seat with her feet tucked under her coat. "You do not heat a sieve, Mr. Vale," Teague said. "You just burn wood while the prairie watches." He left without offering to help. Not because he was cruel, because the math was the math, and Teague was not a man who lied about arithmetic. That night, Orrin counted what he had: $11.40 minus $2 for cornmeal and lard at the store, $9.40. He owed $28 on the stove, $9 on the coffin, $37 in debt. The stove note was held by a dealer 4 days south. The coffin note was held by a road station undertaker who would not come collecting until spring. But the claim agent had made clear, leave before thaw and the land reverts. He could not leave. He could not pay. He could not buy the materials Teague prescribed. He could not cut 6 cords alone before the deep cold locked the country. And every night, the shanty gave away more heat than the stove could make. The wind did not pause. It moved through the walls like water through a sieve, exactly as Teague had said. And somewhere in that image, water through a sieve, Orrin began to understand that the problem was not how little fire he could build. The problem was how fast the shanty gave that fire away. He tried the obvious things first, because a man who skips the obvious things deserves whatever follows. He stuffed dried grass into the worst seams. The grass compressed, held for a few hours, then the wind worked it loose overnight. He found tufts scattered across the floor each morning like the shed fur of an animal. He mixed mud from the creek bank, half frozen, heavy, stinking of clay and rot, and pressed it into the gaps from inside. The mud froze before it bonded to the wood. By morning it had cracked and fallen away in sheets, leaving the gaps wider where the ice had pried the boards apart. He cut strips from flour sacks and nailed them over the widest seams. Frost stiffened the cloth into rigid panels that pulled away from the tacks at every corner. The fabric tore. The nails remained, holding nothing. Each failure cost daylight. Each failure cost warmth, because while he worked, the stove burned unattended, and the children sat in cooling air. Each failure cost something harder to measure, the distance between believing a solution existed and believing the shanty would kill them. Milo stopped stacking kindling chips and started watching his father's hands. Tessa stopped asking when they would go to the cousin's house. The realization came on the 5th day, while Orrin was skinning a winter-killed doe he had found in a coulee a mile south of the claim. The deer had died from something internal, no visible wound, no predator marks. The hide was intact, half frozen, stiff as a board, where the hair lay flat and damp underneath where the body heat had not yet fully left. Orrin worked the skin free with his belt knife. He draped it over a plank near the stove to thaw enough to roll. Within an hour, the hide had softened. Within 2 hours, it had begun to dry at the edges, and as it dried, it shrank. The hide, which had hung loose over the plank, pulled tight against the wood. The edges curled inward. The surface went from soft and pliable to hard and taut, like a drumhead. He remembered. His mother, Martha Vale, in Missouri. A smokehouse with a broken door. She had taken a wet deer hide, tacked it over the frame where the boards had split, and left it overnight. By morning, the hide had pulled so tight the boards groaned. She had made young Orrin press his palm against it and then thump it with 2 fingers. It sounded like a drum. Wet hide remembers being smaller, she had told him. It will pull harder than a man with a rope. He remembered the sour fat smell of scraped skin, the yellow evening light through the smokehouse crack. His mother's hands, always working, pressing the edge of a bone scraper against the membrane until the hide went from slick to rough. He remembered something else. Freight camps. Rawhide lashings used to bind loads on flat-bottom wagons. After a rain, the lashing shrank until the loads creaked. After a week of sun, the rawhide became so hard that teamsters had to cut the knots with hatchets, because no human hand could untie them. Orrin looked at the doe hide drying on the plank. He looked at the gaps in the wall where the candle flame still bent sideways. The logic was simple enough that he almost distrusted it. If the shanty's weakness was moving air, thousands of cracks between warped boards, each one a channel for wind, then covering the interior surface with wet hides would seal those channels as the hides dried and shrank. The rawhide did not need to insulate like wool or felt. It needed to stop the wind. One continuous skin pressed tight against the plank from inside, overlapping at the edges, shrinking until the gaps disappeared beneath it. He turned the idea over. He looked for the flaw. If the hides rotted, the smell would be unbearable, and the seal would fail. If they dried unevenly near the stove, they would split. If he used too many tacks, he would run out before the walls were covered. If he used too few, the hides would tear loose under their own shrinkage. If the method failed entirely, he would have wasted animals that could have been meat. He picked up the doe hide from the plank. It was half dry, stiffening, the edges already pulling away from the wood with visible tension. He held a candle behind it. No light came through. Orrin tacked the hide against the worst section of the west wall. He used 4 tacks, 1 at each corner, and left the center loose. He went to bed. By morning, the hide had pulled flat against the boards. The edges had curled under the tack heads. The surface was smooth and hard, and slightly translucent where the scraping had been thinnest. He held the candle near the wall beside the hide. The flame leaned. He held it near the hide itself. The flame stood straight. 1 hide, 1 section. No wind. He did not celebrate. He counted walls. The shanty was 12 by 16 feet. 2 long walls, 2 short walls, a ceiling with seams, a door frame, a window frame. He calculated area in his head and converted to hides. A large doe hide, scraped and stretched, might cover 8 to 10 square feet, depending on the animal. A bull elk hide could cover 20. The total interior surface, walls, ceiling, seams, door, and window edges, came to roughly 350 square feet, minus the floor and the stove wall where heat would keep the hides too warm. He needed 32 usable hides. He had 31 to go, and the cold was coming. Lavinia Pike found out about the hides on the second day when the smell reached her cabin 40 yards east. Lavinia was 43, a widow whose husband had died of a ruptured appendix 2 winters earlier, leaving her with a tight cabin, a good well, and the grudging respect of men who could not build as well as her dead husband had. She was practical, sharp-tongued, and not cruel. She came to Orrin's door because the smell was impossible to ignore, and because she had 2 boys of her own and wanted to know if disease was being bred next door. She stood in the doorway and looked at the interior wall. 1 hide, tacked and dried, covered a section of the west boards. A second hide, fresh, wet, dark with blood at the edges, hung from tacks on the adjacent section, sagging like a curtain of flesh. Steam rose from it near the stove. The room smelled of raw fat, iron, and something sour that lived in the back of the throat. "Lord," Lavinia said. Orrin was scraping a 3rd hide on a plank outside. He did not look up. Lavinia asked him why he was wasting food animals on walls when his children needed meat on the table. She pointed out that the winter-killed doe could have been quartered and salted. She asked if he had thought about what would happen when the hides rotted in warmth. She asked if he had considered the rats. Orrin hung strips of venison from the rafter pegs, the doe's meat butchered that morning, and continued scraping the hide. "Meat keeps them alive this week," he said. "Stopping that wind keeps them alive after." Lavinia watched him work. She looked at the dried hide on the west wall. She pressed her fingertip against it the way a person tests a bruise, curious and cautious at the same time. "It is tight," she said. "It will get tighter," Orrin said. She left without argument, but she did not leave convinced. She told the women at the store that Orrin Vale was lining his walls with dead animals, and that either he was mad or he was desperate enough to look at, and that she could not decide which was worse for the children. The word spread the way words spread in a settlement of 14 homesteads, quickly, with embellishment, and without mercy. Children at the store called the shanty the butcher room. A boy named Parsons dared another boy to stand downwind and count to 20. The second boy made it to 11 before gagging, though whether from the smell or the performance was unclear. Women crossed the track to avoid walking past Orrin's gate. Someone at Orrin never learned who, nailed a pig bladder to his fence post during the night. He found it in the morning, frozen stiff, dangling from a horseshoe nail like a lantern made of skin. He pulled the bladder off the nail and threw it into the coulee. He scraped another hide. The 4th hide went up wet. It sagged against the tacks like a heavy curtain, dark and glistening, and when the stove heat reached it, the room filled with a steam that smelled of tallow and something older. Tessa buried her face in a quilt. Milo opened the door, and the wind slammed through the room, hard enough to lift the flour sack curtain off the window and drop it on the floor. Orrin shut the door. He nailed the curtain back. He checked the 3 dried hides on the west wall and found them tight, cool, and odorless. The wet hide beside them dripped once, slowly, onto the floor. "They stop smelling," he told Milo. "When they dry, they stop." Milo looked at the wall the way a boy looks at a river he has been told to cross. Not with disbelief, with the kind of trust that costs something to give and more to betray. Rufus Klene heard about the hides on the 3rd day. Klene was 48, the storekeeper, the settlement's only creditor, and a quiet land speculator who understood that failed claims reverted to the company and that the company sold reverted claims to men who could pay cash. He held Orrin's stove note, The dealer in Vermilion had sold the debt north for a discount, and he understood, with the patient clarity of a man who profits from other men's failure, that the claim would be worth more to him if Orrin left before spring. He did not say this. He framed his concern as civic duty. Klene came to the shanty on an afternoon when the wind was strong enough to rattle the tar paper on the roof. He stood inside and looked at the walls. 3 hides were up now, 2 dried, 1 still damp. The overlap between the first and second was uneven, and fat still glistened where the scraping had been incomplete. The room smelled like a tanner's floor. "Mr. Vale," Klene said, "a man who papers his walls with dead animals has already surrendered to winter." Orrin drove a tack through the corner of the 3rd hide and did not respond. Klene continued. He said the hides would rot. He said the smell would carry disease. He said the children would sicken faster inside a room lined with raw flesh than they would in honest cold. He said the settlement had standards, and that a filthy house bred fever, and that those children should be boarded somewhere respectable. "I can arrange placement for them in town," Klene said. "There are families who would take them through the winter. You could work the claim alone and settle your accounts by spring." Orrin understood the shape of the offer. Board the children with families who owed Klene credit. Work the claim alone through a winter that the shanty could not survive. Fail. Leave. Let the claim revert. Let Klene buy it from the company for a fraction of its value. "The children stay with me," Orrin said. Klene nodded as though he had expected this. He produced a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Your stove note," he said. $28. I purchased it from Aldridge in Vermilion. Payment is due before first thaw, or I am entitled to seize the stove and any attached improvements." He let the word improvements hang in the air like smoke. "I can extend the terms," Klene said, "if you sign a paper granting me first purchase option on the claim. A simple agreement. You keep working. If you prove up, you sell to me at a fair price. If you leave, the claim reverts and we both go our separate ways." Orrin looked at the paper. He looked at Klene. He looked at Milo, who stood near the stove holding a split of cottonwood in both hands like a weapon he did not know how to use. "No," Orrin said. Klene folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. "The note stands, Mr. Vale. $28 before thaw." He left. The door caught on the leather hinge and let a blade of cold air across the floor. Tessa pulled her feet under her coat. Milo put the cottonwood split into the stove without being asked. That evening, after the children slept, Orrin held the candle near the 3 dried hides. The flame did not bend. He held it near the bare wall beside them. The flame leaned hard enough to gutter. 3 hides sealed, 29 to go. Klene held the stove note. The temperature had dropped 4 degrees since morning, and somewhere west of the Missouri, the weather that would define the winter was already forming. The 4th hide went up the next morning, the 5th by afternoon. Orrin worked with the knife and the scraper and the tacks in a rhythm that ate daylight and left his hands raw. Each hide required the same sequence. Thaw if frozen, flesh the membrane, scrape the fat, cut to shape, soak in creek water until pliable. Tack the top edge first, pull the bottom corner diagonally, set the side tacks 2 inches from the edge, leave the center loose for shrinkage, and wait. The waiting was the hardest part. A hide needed 12 to 20 hours to dry, depending on its thickness, its distance from the stove, and the moisture in the air. Too close to the stove and the surface dried before the center, leaving brittle patches that cracked under tension. Too far, and the hide stayed damp long enough to sour at the edges. Orrin had 6 hides up by the end of the first week. The west wall was nearly covered. The smell had settled into something constant, not rot, not fresh blood, but the flat mineral odor of drying skin that lived in the walls like a second presence. Milo stopped noticing it. Tessa said the house smelled like the freight camp where her father used to work, and this was true. and it was the first time she had spoken about the past without crying. But 6 hides were not 32, and the cold was not waiting. The morning temperature on the 7th day dropped low enough that the water bucket inside the shanty grew a crust of ice by dawn. Orrin could see his breath against the bare north wall. Against the covered west wall, the air was still enough that the candle flame stood like a painted thing. He needed hides, more hides than one man with 3 traps could produce. The winter-killed doe had been luck. He could not rely on finding carcasses. He needed to hunt, and hunting meant leaving the children, and leaving the children meant the stove would burn unattended, and an unattended stove in a shanty with tar paper on the roof was a prayer waiting to be answered wrong. He set traps in the coulees south of the claim. He walked the creek banks before dawn looking for sign. On the 3rd morning he found tracks, 2 deer moving east along the frozen creek, and followed them for 2 miles before the trail crossed open ground and disappeared into wind-scoured grass. He came home with nothing except blisters on his heels and frost on his eyebrows thick enough to crack when he blinked. He bargained with a trapper named Doss, who had 3 damaged elk hides he planned to discard. The hair was slipping, and the edges were chewed by mice. Orrin traded 2 pounds of venison for the hides and spent a full day cutting away the ruined sections and patching the usable pieces together with rawhide strips soaked in warm water. The patches held. The seams between them were uneven and ugly, but ugly was not the same as open, and open was the only thing that mattered. 9 hides, then 11. The south wall took shape behind a patchwork of deer, elk, and 1 antelope skin so thin he doubled it over the worst crack. His hands split at the knuckles from the cold water and the scraping. The fat under his fingernails would not wash out. At night his forearms ached from the constant pulling and pressing, and he slept with his fists clenched because his fingers would not straighten. Milo helped where a 9-year-old could help. He carried tacks in a tin cup. He held the bottom edge of a hide while Orrin hammered the top. Once, when a wet hide slipped from its tacks and fell across Milo's shoulders, the boy stood there without flinching, the cold, wet weight draped over him like a cloak, and said, "It is heavy." Orrin took it from him and saw that his son's shirt was soaked through, and his lips had gone white. He made Milo sit by the stove for an hour and did not ask him to hold another hide that day. Tessa's job was the candle. Every evening she walked the perimeter of the room carrying the tin holder, pausing at each section of wall. Where the hides were dry, she said, "Still." Where the bare boards showed, she said, "Moving." It became a game. She did not understand that she was mapping the difference between life and death. She understood that her father watched the flame and that his face changed when she said "still." And every evening he held the candle to the wall and watched. Covered sections, still flame. Bare sections, the flame bent, reaching toward the gaps as though the wind outside were calling to the fire inside, asking it to come out and die. 12 hides up, 20 to go. Then a setback that nearly broke the sequence. Orrin had tacked a large doe hide across the north wall near the door frame, positioning it to cover a section where 3 boards had warped apart and the gap was wide enough to fit a finger. The hide went up damp in the late afternoon. By midnight, the section nearest the stove had dried. By morning, the center had begun to pull, but the edge closest to the door, furthest from the heat, exposed to cold air leaking around the frame, stayed wet. The tension between the dry center and the wet edge tore the hide along a line of weak scraping where Orrin had rushed. The tear ran 6 inches, and the flap curled back from the wall like skin peeling from a burn. Orrin stared at it. The tear was not a complete failure. The remaining section still held tight against the boards, but the torn flap exposed the gap he had meant to seal, and the candle flame bent toward it with the focused precision of a finger pointing at a mistake. He cut the flap away and patched the tier with a strip of elk hide soaked in warm water, tacking it across the damaged section with 3 tacks he could not afford to waste. The patch held, but it had cost him 2 hours and 3 tacks, and he had fewer of both than anyone knew. The telegraph report reached Broken Kettle on a freight wagon, freezing rain west of the Missouri, of the Sadonti, a hard drop expected within days. The old men in the settlement remembered sudden storms, mornings that started mild, and afternoons that killed. They remembered cattle found standing frozen in fields, still upright because the ice had locked their legs before they could fall. They remembered the children's blizzard, not yet a year old, when the temperature plunged so fast that school children caught between buildings never reached the door. Orrin heard the report and looked at his walls, half covered, half bare. The south and west were sealed. The north was patched and holding. The east wall and the ceiling seams remained open, and the ceiling was the worst. Every gust pushed fine snow through the tar paper and deposited a white line of powder along the rafter edge. He had 1 cord and 3/4 of wood remaining. He had 47 tacks in a coffee tin. He had 14 usable hides drying or on the wall, and he needed 18 more. The traps had produced 2 fox pelts too small for wall use and 1 coyote too thin to hold tension. The temperature dropped 3 degrees overnight, then 4 the next night. The creek ice thickened until Orrin could walk across it without cracking. The air developed that particular stillness that old settlers recognized. Not calm, but coiled, the way a sky holds its breath before it opens. Tell us in the comments, have you ever built something while everyone around you was certain it would fail? Orrin picked up the scraper. He soaked another hide. And outside, past the edge of the settlement, the sky to the west had turned the color of a bruise that has not yet finished forming. Marit Brecky arrived at Orrin's gate on a Tuesday morning carrying a canvas sack of bone scrapers and a jar of rendered lard she said was for her own use. She was 58, Norwegian-born, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood as the tools she carried. She had come to the Dakota settlements by way of the Red River fish camps in Minnesota, where she had worked for 11 years mending nets, sewing sailcloth, repairing hide storage covers, and doing whatever else required a needle, a knife, or the patience to sit with difficult material until it cooperated. Her husband had died of typhus on the crossing. She had not remarried. She lived in a sod-roofed cabin a quarter-mile north of Broken Kettle and kept to herself in a way that people mistook for unfriendliness, but was actually the economy of a woman who had learned that most talk produced nothing worth hearing. She had heard about the hides. She had not come because of the smell or the gossip or the children. She had come because someone at the store had described the overlapping pattern, and the description had interested her. Orrin was tacking a wet elk hide along the east wall when she appeared in the doorway. He did not know her. She did not introduce herself immediately. She stood and looked at the walls, the dried hides on the west and south, the patch section on the north, the fresh wet hide sagging on the east. And she walked the perimeter the way Teague had, pressing her palm flat against each surface. But where Teague had tested for failure, Marit tested for intention. She stopped at the corner where 2 hides overlapped. The overlap ran vertically, with the upper hide laid over the lower like shingles on a roof. The seam faced away from the west wall, away from the prevailing wind. "You shingled them against the wind," she said. Orrin looked at her. "The wind pushes from the west. If the edges face west, the wind lifts them. If they face east, the wind presses them down." Marit nodded once. It was not a nod of approval. It was the nod of someone who has found competence where they did not expect it and is recalculating. "You are not decorating," she said. "You are making one wall out of many." She set her canvas sack on the floor and opened it. Inside were 3 bone scrapers of different widths, a curved blade with a wooden handle worn smooth from decades of use, and a coil of rawhide cord thin enough to thread through an awl hole. "Your edges are too fat," she said. She picked up the nearest dried hide. The antelope skin doubled over the east wall crack and ran her thumbnail along the overlap where it met the adjacent elk hide. A thin line of yellowish grease appeared. Fat does not bond. Fat sours. When it sours, the edge lifts. When the edge lifts, you have a seam again. She showed him. She took the curved blade and scraped the overlap edge of a drying hide until the surface went from slick to rough, from yellow to white. The motion was quick and certain, the blade angled low, pulling toward her body, stripping the membrane in curls thinner than paper. She did not explain while she worked. She worked, and the work was the explanation. Orrin watched her hands. They moved the way his mother's hands had moved around the smokehouse, with the specific confidence of someone who has handled skin so many times that the material has become a language. "Do the edges before you tack them," Marit said. "Clean edges bond to the wall. Dirty edges float above it." The first lesson took 20 minutes. Orrin scraped the edges of the next 3 hides before tacking them, and the difference was visible within hours. The overlap seams lay flatter, pulled tighter, and left no gap where a candle flame could find purchase. The second lesson came that afternoon. Orrin had been tacking hides the way a man hangs a picture. 4 corners first, then fill the edges. Marit watched him drive the upper left tack of a deer hide into the east wall, then reach for the upper right corner. "Stop," she said. She took the hide down. She set one tack in the upper left corner and pulled the lower right corner diagonally, stretching the hide across the boards at an angle. She held the tension with one hand and set a tack at the lower right with the other. Then she released the hide. It hung at a slight diagonal, slack in the center, tight at 2 opposing corners. "Now the shrinkage has somewhere to go," she said. "If you pin all 4 corners first, the hide dries against itself. It fights the tacks. Tacks lose." She filled in the remaining edges, top right, then bottom left, then the spaces between, always pulling against the existing tension, always leaving the center loose enough that the drying hide could contract without tearing. "A skin is not a board," she said. "It wants to move. Let it move where you choose." By evening, Orrin had retacked 2 hides using the staggered method. Both dried flatter and pulled harder than any he had done before. The surface had a uniformity that the earlier hides lacked. No bubbles, no wrinkles, no pockets where air could gather between the hide and the plank. The third lesson came the next morning, and it came because of a failure. A large doe hide that Orrin had tacked near the stove wall, closer than the others, because the stove wall had the worst gaps, and he wanted it sealed first, dried too fast. The surface nearest the iron went rigid while the center was still damp. The tension between the brittle edge and the pliable center built through the night like a rope twisting around itself. At dawn, the hide split with a sound like a rifle shot. Tessa screamed. Milo grabbed the water bucket. Orrin stood in the center of the room with his heart slamming against his ribs, staring at a crack that ran from the upper left tack to the center of the hide, the 2 halves curling away from the wall like pages of a book falling open. He wanted to tear the whole wall down. He wanted to rip every hide off every board and start over with something that was not skin and not madness, and not the gamble of a man who had no other cards. Marit was there. She had come early, carrying a jar of snow to melt for scraping water. She looked at the split hide and then at Orrin. "Patch it," she said. "It is ruined." "It is torn." "Torn is not ruined. Patch across the split with a wet strip. The strip shrinks over the crack and holds the edges together. The wall behind it is still sealed where the original tacks hold. She cut a strip from a leftover elk neck piece, soaked it in warm water, and pressed it over the split. Orrin drove tacks through the strip into the wall on either side of the crack. The wet strip covered the gap. By noon, it had dried tight, pulling the torn edges together beneath it like a bandage drawn closed. The lesson was not about patching. The lesson was about distance from the stove. Slow drying makes stronger tension, Marit said. Fast drying makes glass. Keep the hides at least 4 feet from the iron. 5 is better. The room's warmth will reach them. The stove's heat will break them. Orrin moved the remaining wet hides away from the stove wall. The drying time increased from 12 hours to 20. He could not afford the delay, but he could afford broken hides even less. 16 hides covered the walls. The west and south were sealed. The north was patched and tight. The east wall had 8 hides up, with gaps remaining near the window frame and along the baseboard where the plank met frozen ground. The ceiling still leaked. Fine snow still dusted the rafter edges during gusts, and the door frame had no gasket. Orrin needed 16 more usable hides. He had the material for maybe 10. The traps produced slowly. The coolies held fewer carcasses as the cold deepened and scavengers worked faster. He traded his last pound of venison to a Métis trapper for 2 buffalo calf hides too small for robes but large enough for ceiling patches. He retrieved a frozen deer from a ravine south of the creek, half eaten by coyotes, the hide torn along the belly, and saved enough of the back section to cover 6 square feet of east wall. 21 hides, 11 to go. Then Klene moved. The storekeeper did not come to the shanty. He did not need to. He bought every remaining tack, brad, and small nail in his own store and paid a freighter's boy 2 bits to buy the same from the blacksmith's scrap bin. By the end of the day, there was not a tack for sale within 17 miles of Broken Kettle. Orrin learned this when he went to buy a half-pound of tacks and found the bin empty. The clerk, a boy of 16 who worked for Klene, said the stock had been purchased that morning by a single buyer. The clerk did not say who. He did not need to. Orrin stood in the store with his hand on the counter and his breath visible in the cold air that leaked through Kline's own poorly sealed loading door. He had 23 tacks remaining in his coffee tin. 23 tacks to hang 11 hides. The math was simple and lethal. At a minimum of 8 tacks per hide for the staggered method, he could hang fewer than 3 more hides before running out. Milo overheard. The boy reached into his coat pocket and produced a small object wrapped in cloth. His mother's silver thimble, Clara's thimble, dented on one side with her initials scratched into the base. Milo held it out. "We can trade it," Milo said. Orrin looked at the thimble. He closed his son's fingers around it. "No," he said. "We keep what she gave us." They walked home in silence. Orrin counted tacks in his head. 23. Not enough. Not close to enough. The wind cut across the track and found the gaps in his coat collar the way it found the gaps in his walls. Precisely, patiently, without mercy. Lavinia Pike arrived at dusk. She carried a coffee tin. Inside were 31 mismatched fasteners, upholstery tacks with wide brass heads, boot nails with square shanks, bent brads straightened with pliers, carpet tacks pulled from a trunk lining, and 6 finishing nails cut short with a hatchet. They were the scrapings of a dead man's tool chest, her husband's, and they were not meant for hanging hides on walls. A bad idea tested honestly deserves better than a storekeeper's thumb on the scale, Lavinia said. Orrin took the tin. He did not thank her with words. He nodded, and the nod carried the weight that words would have made lighter. With the salvaged fasteners and his remaining tacks, Orrin had 54 pieces of metal to hang 11 hides. It was enough if he was careful. If he spaced the tacks wider on hides that would shrink tighter, if he used the boot nails on corners and the brads on edges, if nothing tore, if nothing split, if the metal held. 27 hides went up over the next 3 days. Orrin and Marit worked from dawn until the candle was the only light. She scraped edges. He cut and soaked. Milo carried tacks and held plank edges. Tessa walked the candle. The ceiling was the worst. Orrin stood on the stove to reach the rafter seams, pressing wet hide strips overhead, while Marit tacked from a stool. His shoulders shook from holding the weight. Hide water ran down his arms and soaked his shirt. Twice the hide slipped and fell across his face, blinding him with cold, wet skin that smelled of tallow and creek water. He caught it both times and pressed it back against the boards. 27, 29, 30. The ceiling seams disappeared behind overlapping strips of deer and elk hide. The window frame received a gasket of twisted rawhide cord, soaked and tacked, that swelled as it dried and pressed against the sash. The door frame remained open. Orrin had 2 hides left and 9 fasteners. Anson Teague returned on the day the 30th hide went up. He had not visited since his first inspection 3 weeks earlier. He had watched from a distance, the way a man watches a horse race he has already bet against, and he had heard the reports, the smell, the tacks, Klein's maneuvering, Lavinia's coffee tin. He came now because the weather report had reached him, and he wanted to see what a dead man's room looked like before the storm killed him. He stood inside the shanty and pressed his palm against the west wall. His hand stopped flat against a surface as tight and hard as a drumhead. He rapped it with his knuckles. It gave a low, dense sound, not hollow like a plank, not ringing like metal, but something between, as though the wall had acquired a second skin that absorbed the blow. He moved to the south wall, same surface, same tension. He pressed harder. The hide did not flex. He looked at the overlapping edges, the staggered tacks, the patches across the torn section near the stove wall. He looked at the ceiling strips and the window gasket and the wet hide strip Orrin was fitting around the door frame. "The shrinkage is pulling the boards," Teague said. Orrin looked at him. "The hides are contracting harder than the tacks can resist on thin plank. If the shrinkage continues, it may pull the boards inward, or it may tear the tack heads through the hide. Either way, if it fails all at once." Orrin knew this. He had felt the tension building, the walls humming faintly when the wind gusted, the tacks creaking at night as the hides continued to contract in cold air. "It may hold," Orrin said. "It may," Teague said. He did not add anything. He pressed his hand against the wall one more time, feeling the tension through his palm the way he had felt green lumber bow under a crossbeam 40 years ago, and he left. The final 2 hides went up over the door frame at midnight. Orrin's shoulders trembled so badly he dropped the hammer twice. Marit made him sleep for 2 hours while she and Lavinia watched the stove. Tessa slept curled against the west wall, the sealed wall, the warm wall, the wall that did not breathe. In the morning, Orrin performed the test. He lit the candle and walked the perimeter. West wall, still. South wall, still. North wall, still, except for a faint flutter near the baseboard where the last patch had not fully dried. East wall, still. Ceiling, still. Window, still. Door, a slight movement near the threshold where the bottom strip could not reach the frozen ground. Marit soaked a rawhide strip and tacked it around the door jamb. By afternoon, the strip had dried and the flame steadied. The stove test came next. Before the rawhide, 1 armload of split cottonwood burned down in less than 2 hours, and the room froze at the corners. Now, Orrin loaded the same amount. 2 hours later, coals still glowed. The kettle was warm. The corners of the room were cool, but not cold. Frost had not formed on the blanket nails. He loaded the stove again at dusk. By dawn, the coals held enough heat to warm water. The room had cooled overnight, but not frozen. The water bucket had a skin of ice on top, thin, not solid. The children had slept without waking. He did not claim victory. He counted wood instead. 1 cord and a quarter remaining. Before the hides, that amount would have lasted a week. Now it might last 3, maybe 4, if he burned carefully and the stove held. But the storm was not ordinary cold. The storm was something else. Teague said the room might hold normal wind, but could not survive freezing rain followed by a hard northwest blow. Klein told townspeople the stink alone would sicken the children before the cold reached them. The men at the store shook their heads and said that a hunter's trick was not a carpenter's answer, and that Orrin Vale would learn the difference when the temperature dropped. Rain began tapping on the roof at noon. By mid-afternoon, it clicked as ice. The door handle glazed. Horses in the settlement turned their rumps to the wind and stood with their heads down and their ears flat. The telegraph line went dead. The sky to the northwest had gone from gray to the color of iron shavings, and the wind had shifted from south to west and was still turning. Marit appeared at the door carrying linen strips and a jar of rendered fat. She told Orrin that a skin wall was like a sail. One small tier could become the place where force gathered. She inspected every tack, every overlap, every corner where the hides met. She pressed fat into 3 seams where the drying had left hairline gaps between hide and plank. She told Orrin to keep the stove steady, not roaring, not dying, and to watch the door. Orrin watched the door. Outside, the ice built on every surface. Inside, the candle flames stood still. The storm hit Broken Kettle at 11 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, though no one had a watch accurate enough to confirm this. And it did not matter. What mattered was the sound. The wind came first, a long, low moan that built into a roar that rattled the tar paper and shook the stovepipe in its collar. Then the ice, not rain, not snow, but something between. A sleet that struck the walls like sand thrown by a giant hand. The temperature had been falling all day. It fell faster now. The air outside went from cold to lethal in the time it took to close a door. Across the settlement, the first casualties were architectural. The blacksmith's lean-to lost its north wall in a gust that peeled the boards away like pages from a book. A chicken coop behind the store collapsed under ice weight. The schoolhouse chimney cracked where the mortar had dried too fast the previous summer, and smoke began leaking into the wall cavity. Within an hour, every building in Broken Kettle was engaged in a private war against the same enemy, and most of them were losing. Inside the shanty, the rawhide walls darkened. The hides absorbed the cold, the way skin absorbs a bruise, slowly from the outside in. The surface went from room temperature to cool to cold, to the point where Orrin could see the moisture in his breath condense against the hide when he leaned close. But the flame did not bend. The walls did not whistle. The sound was different, not the high keening of wind through cracks, but a low, steady hum, as though the hides were vibrating with the pressure of the gusts without letting the air through. Milo noticed first. "The house sounds alive," he said. Orrin told him not to be afraid, but Orrin was afraid. He was afraid because the hides were doing something he had hoped for but never tested at the scale. They were holding, and holding meant the pressure had nowhere to go except against the tacks, the boards, and the tension of the hides themselves. An hour passed. The stove burned steady. The room held. The temperature inside dropped slowly. The west wall was cold to the touch. and the window gasket had frosted at the edges, but the air did not move. The children sat near the stove and ate cornbread from a pan Orrin had baked that morning. Then Lavinia Pike hammered on the door. Her cabin had smoke trouble. The wind was blowing down her chimney, reversing the draft, filling the loft with smoke thick enough to choke. Her boys had gone to the blacksmith's shed, but her youngest nephew, Eli, had been caught between houses after bringing feed to the cow. He was 7 years old. His hands were stiff. His breathing had gone shallow, and his lips had turned a color that Lavinia did not want to describe. Orrin opened the door. The cold hit the room like a wall of water. The air that slammed through the doorway was so dense with ice particles that it looked white. One rawhide strip near the threshold, the last one tacked, the one that had dried for barely 12 hours, tore loose at the bottom edge. The strip peeled upward along the door seam like bark lifting from a tree, and the wind found the gap instantly, driving a blade of frozen air across the floor. Lavinia carried Eli inside. The boy's hands were curled into fists he could not open. His coat was glazed with ice. His breathing came in shallow hitches that sounded like a clock winding down. Orrin slammed the door. The wind pushed back. He leaned his weight against the plank and felt the gust press through the new gap where the strip had torn. The candle on the shelf guttered, bent, and nearly went out. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because this is the moment Orrin learns whether he built a shelter or a trap. The torn strip hung from one tack, swinging in the draft. The gap beneath it was no wider than 2 fingers. But in a sealed room, 2 fingers of open air was a crack in a dam. Orrin could feel the cold pouring through it, spreading across the floor like water running downhill. Marit was already moving. She pulled a tack from her coat pocket. She had carried spares from home and heated it over the stove until the metal was warm enough to drive without cracking the hide. Milo held the candle near the tier so Orrin could see the edge. Tessa pulled Eli closer to the stove and made him count the drops falling from the kettle spout. 1, 2, 3. The boy's lips moved. His eyes stayed open. Lavinia rubbed the boy's hands between her own, pressing the fingers open, working the joints. She was terrified. Orrin could see it in the set of her jaw and the speed of her breathing. She had carried the boy into the only warm room in Broken Kettle, and if that room failed now, she had carried him into a coffin. Orrin cut a fresh strip from the last piece of elk neck hide, the piece Marit had used for patches, now nearly exhausted. He soaked it in warm water from the kettle. The strip went from stiff to pliable in 30 seconds. He pressed it over the torn section of the door seam, covering the gap, and drove the warm tack through the upper corner. Marit pressed her shoulder against the door to hold it shut, while the wind shoved from outside. Orrin drove a second tack through the lower corner. The strip held. But the wind was not finished. The door itself flexed inward with each gust, and the gap between the door edge and the frame opened and closed like a mouth breathing. The rawhide gasket around the jamb held on the hinge side, but pulled loose at the latch side, where the leather hinges allowed the plank to shift. Orrin soaked another strip. He tacked it over the latch side gap. The wind pushed the door inward. The strip compressed against the frame. The wind eased. The strip held its position. The seal was not perfect, but the candle flames stopped bending. Outside, the storm did not care about their repairs. The temperature continued to fall. The ice thickened on every surface. Across the yard, Teague's well-built cabin, the best-constructed house in Broken Kettle, with proper daubing and tight-fitted logs, still leaked where the roof met the wall. Frost formed on the inside of his window frame. His stove, a heavy box stove twice the size of Orrin's, consumed wood at twice the rate he had planned. The draft through the roof joint was not large, but it was persistent, and persistent wind undid a fire the way persistent water undid a dam, Not all at once, but fast enough to matter. He burned through half his night supply by 8 o'clock and began rationing at a pace that would leave the house cold by dawn. Klein's store, larger and sealed with felt paper that had aged and cracked around the loading door, filled with smoke when the chimney draft reversed a second time. The wind outside pressed harder than the fire's updraft, and the smoke had nowhere to go but back into the room. Klene and his clerk opened the loading door to clear the air, and the wind blew a sheet of ice particles across the flour barrels. The door froze open. They stuffed it with sacking and blankets. The smoke cleared. The cold came in. Flour sacks froze to the floorboards. 2 windows cracked from the ice pressure, and the cracks let threads of wind through that no amount of rags could stop. Every building in Broken Kettle fought the same fight that night. Every building that relied on daubing, felt paper, or planked seams lost some portion of that fight. The wind found every weakness, the ice sealed every exit, and the stoves burned wood at rates that no one had budgeted for, because no one had budgeted for a night when the air itself turned into an enemy. At 9:30, Deputy Asa Bell tried to reach the store. He had been in the claim office, a single room with a potbelly stove and walls sealed with newsprint and paste, which leaked at every window, and decided that the store would be warmer. He made it 60 yards before the wind knocked him sideways, and the ice under his boots sent him sprawling. He tried to stand. His hands found no grip on the frozen ground. He crawled toward the nearest light, Orrin's window, faintly orange through the frost, and collapsed against the woodpile. Milo saw the shape through the ice on the window glass. A dark form, hunched against the stacked wood, not moving. Orrin looked at the door, the patched seam, the fresh tacks, the room that was holding. "Someone is outside," Milo said. Orrin opened the door. The cold hit again. The patched strip held this time. Marit had double-tacked it. But the door gasket flexed, and a line of ice air cut across the room. They dragged Bell inside. The deputy's coat was frozen rigid. His beard was white with ice. His fingers were gray. He did not speak. He breathed in short gasps, and his eyes moved without focusing. 6 people in a room built for 3. Wet coats, damp boots, melting ice on the floor. The stove burning through its load faster now because every time the door opened, the room lost heat that took 20 minutes to rebuild. The rawhide walls boomed with each gust, a deep, resonant sound like a drum struck with an open palm. The hides flexed inward a fraction of an inch when the wind hit and returned to flat when the gust passed. The tacks creaked. The boards groaned. The room sounded like a living thing breathing against the storm, but the air did not move. The candle flames stood. Orrin loaded the stove. He rationed the wood, 3 splits at a time, no more, spaced 20 minutes apart. The room cooled between loadings. The corners went cold, but the temperature near the children's pallet stayed warm enough that frost did not form on the blanket nails. Their breath fogged near the wall but did not freeze. Eli's hands uncurled. His breathing deepened. Color returned to his fingers, first red, then pink, then the ordinary color of a boy's skin that has been frightened and is forgetting why. Bell woke at midnight. He looked at the walls, the stretched hides, the patched seams, the tack heads catching stove light, and he did not understand what he was seeing, Lavinia told him. He pressed his palm against the nearest hide and felt the tension humming through the surface. "How long has it been warm in here?" he asked. "Since before the storm," Orrin said. Bell looked at the stove. The fire was low, coals and 2 splits, not a roaring blaze. He looked at the door, where the gasket strips bulged inward with each gust. He looked at the ceiling, where hide strips covered the rafter seams and not a flake of snow had entered. "My quarters at Fort Sisseton were not this tight," he said, and then he closed his eyes and slept. By dawn, Orrin had burned less than half the wood that Teague had calculated a storm night would cost in a sealed cabin. The water bucket near the west wall had a skin of ice, but not solid ice. Eli sat up and asked for water. Belle's fingers had regained color. The door gasket had held through the night. The patched seam near the threshold had dried tight in the room's warmth, sealing itself more firmly with every hour. Outside, the settlement looked like something encased in glass. Every surface was coated in ice. Fence posts wore sleeves of frozen rain. The store's loading door was sealed shut by ice thicker than a man's thumb. Horses stood with the tails frozen to their flanks. The telegraph line lay on the ground in 3 places where the ice weight had snapped the wire. Orrin stood in the doorway and looked at the yard. The wind had died to a steady push from the northwest, cold but no longer violent. The temperature was still dangerous, but the killing phase, the sudden drop, the ice rain, the wind that turned every unsealed crack into a weapon, had passed. Behind him, the room hummed faintly. The hides vibrated with the residual wind, producing that low drum note that had frightened Milo hours earlier. It did not sound like madness anymore. It sounded like walls that had held. Morning showed a town encased in glass. People did not come to Orrin's shanty to laugh. They came because their own cabins had failed. The first was a woman named Hester Goss, whose husband had gone to the rail spur 3 days before the storm and had not returned. Her cabin had a cracked chimney and a loft so drafty that ice formed on the children's blankets before midnight. She had kept her 3 children alive by pulling the mattress off the bed frame, dragging it beside the stove, and burning every piece of scrap wood in the house, including 2 chair legs and the handle of a broom. By dawn, she had nothing left to burn. She stood in Orrin's doorway with her youngest on her hip and looked at the walls the way a person looks at a locked door when they can see warmth on the other side. "How?" she said. Orrin showed her the candle. He held it near the west wall. The flame did not move. He held it near Hester's coat, and the draft from her collar, cold air trapped in the wool, made the flame bend harder than anything inside the room. He told her the principle, not the full method. Not yet. Just the principle. The problem was not fuel. The problem was moving air. A house that leaked wind was not a shelter, but a bellows, and no amount of firewood could outrun a bellows. Hester looked at the hide-covered walls. She touched the surface with the flat of her hand the way everyone did, palm pressed, feeling the tension, the hardness, the strange aliveness of dried skin pulled taut against plank. "It is warm," she said, and her voice broke on the second word because warmth had become something that could make a woman cry. Anson Teague came at mid-morning. He did not knock. He opened the door and stood inside and looked at the room the way a builder looks at a structure that has violated his expectations. His jaw was set. His eyes moved from wall to wall, from ceiling to floor, from the stove, banked low, barely glowing, to the water bucket near the west wall where the ice had melted to a thin ring around the rim. He pressed his palm against the west wall. He held it there for a long time. Then he moved to the south wall, then the north. At each surface, he felt the tension, the density, the absolute stillness of the air behind the hide. He found the patched section near the stove wall where the hide had split, and Marit's strip covered the crack. He ran his thumbnail along the patch edge, tight, bonded. The shrinkage had pulled the patch into the original surface until the seam was barely visible. He found the door gaskets, the strips tacked around the jamb, the emergency patches from the storm, the double-tacked threshold strip that had held through the second door opening when they dragged Belle inside. He stood in the center of the room and said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of speech. "I was wrong about the material," Teague said. Orrin waited. "I was not wrong about the danger. The shrinkage could have torn the tacks through. The boards could have bowed. The whole wall could have peeled away in the wind." "It did not," Orrin said. "It did not," Teague said. "You beat it because you treated air like water and gave it no crack to run through." He looked at the stove. The coals from the night's final loading were still warm enough to heat the kettle. In Teague's cabin, with its proper daubing and tight-fitted logs, he had burned nearly 2 full stove loads overnight. Orrin had burned 1 careful load in a coal bank. The difference was not small. The difference was the distance between a man who runs out of wood in January and a man who makes it to March. "Show me the door gasket," Teague said. Orrin showed him. Teague studied the soaked rawhide strip, the way it had swelled as it dried, pressing against the frame and the door edge simultaneously, creating a seal that flexed when the door moved but did not open. He pressed it with his thumb. It gave slightly and returned. "I've been building tight rooms for 40 years, Teague said. "I've never thought to make the seal move with the door." He left and came back an hour later with a piece of paper and a carpenter's pencil. He drew the gasket cross-section while Orrin described the soaking, the tacking, and the drying sequence. It was the first time anyone had written down anything about the method. Lavinia Pike's conversion was quieter. She came in the afternoon, after the boys had been fed, and the cow had been watered from melted ice. She did not ask to see the walls. She had been inside the room during the storm. She had felt the air hold steady while 6 people breathed and dripped and the stove burned low. She had watched Eli's hands uncurl. She did not need a demonstration. She sat on the bench near the stove and looked at Orrin. "I told women at the store that you were lining your walls with dead animals and that you might be mad," she said. "I heard," Orrin said. "I was not wrong about the dead animals," she said. "I was wrong about the mad." She asked questions. How much overlap at the seams? Which side of the hide against the wall, flesh or hair? How close to the stove was too close? Could cowhide work, or only deer and elk? What about muslin soaked in glue, or canvas backed with flour paste? Could a person seal just the worst cracks instead of the whole wall? Orrin answered what he knew. Overlap by 4 inches. Flesh side against the wall where the scraping was clean, hair side out where it was not. 4 feet minimum from the stove. Cowhide would work, but was thicker and harder to tack. Muslin and canvas might help for lighter drafts. He did not know. Sealing only the worst cracks was better than sealing nothing. He admitted what he did not know. He did not know how long the hides would last before they needed replacement. He did not know whether summer heat would make them smell again. He did not know whether insects would eat them. He did not know if the method worked in a log cabin the same as in a plank shanty, because he had only ever tried it in one room. Lavinia wrote nothing down. She listened with the focused attention of a woman who had survived one winter alone and intended to survive the next one better. The community came in 1s and 2s over the following days. Not suddenly kind, not suddenly respectful, needy. Their cabins had failed in specific ways, and they wanted specific answers. A man named Torvik, whose sod house leaked at every window frame, asked whether rawhide strips around the sashes would help. Orrin said yes, and showed him the window gasket. Torvik went home and tried it with a piece of cowhide his wife had saved from a butchered steer. The draft dropped enough that he noticed it within a day. A woman named Doll, whose loft froze so badly that her children slept downstairs on the kitchen floor, asked whether sealing strips were possible without standing on a stove. Marit showed her a method using a pole brace, a forked stick pressed against the ceiling to hold the wet hide in place, while tacks were driven from a stool. The pole brace became standard. Measurable comparisons emerged as people talked. Teague had burned nearly twice as much wood as Orrin during the storm night. Klein's store had lost more heat through the loading door in 2 hours than Orrin's room lost in 12. Lavinia's loft had frosted at the eaves, while Orrin's ceiling strips held snow dust to 0. Hester Goss, who had burned her furniture, calculated that if her cabin had been sealed the way Orrin's was, she would have had wood left for 3 more days. The numbers moved through the settlement the way the gossip about the butcher room had moved, quickly, with less embellishment, and with a different kind of weight. Orrin did not hoard the method. He showed anyone who asked, and some who did not. He showed Torvik how to cut rawhide strips thin enough for window frame gaskets and wide enough for wall patches. He showed Hester Goss how to test a wall with a candle, holding the flame an inch from the surface and moving it slowly along the seam until it bent, then marking the leak with a charcoal scratch. Hester taught the technique to her children, who taught it to the doll children, who turned it into a game. Within a week, 3 families had chalk marks on their walls where the candle had found the wind. Marit showed the women a different set of skills. She showed them how to scrape edges clean for tight overlap, how to soak rawhide in lukewarm water rather than cold to make it more pliable for gasket work, and how to use the pole brace, a forked stick pressed against the ceiling, to hang overhead strips without standing on a stove. Lavinia organized children to collect bent nails from the rubbish heap behind the blacksmith's shed and straighten them with a hammer and a flat stone. The nails were imperfect, crooked, different lengths, some missing heads, but they held tacks and wood, and that was enough. The town's first copies of the method were not whole rawhide rooms. They were patches. A rawhide-banded pantry door in Torvik's house, a sealed sickroom corner in the schoolhouse, gasket strips around Hester Goss's windows, a doubled cowhide strip over the worst crack in the doll family's loft, which dropped the nighttime frost on their children's blankets from a crust to a glaze to nothing. The principle spread faster than the material, because the principle was simple, stopped the air, and the material was secondary. A man with no hides could use canvas. A woman with no canvas could use flour sacking backed with paste. The method was not sacred. The understanding was. Klein watched the spread from behind his store counter and understood that something had shifted. He did not become generous. He did not become kind. He became strategic. He told townspeople that raw hides were a health hazard, rot, vermin, disease, and that only properly inspected hides should be used for interior sealing, inspected naturally through his store. He proposed a fee, 2 bits per hide for a cleanliness certificate stamped with his seal, verifying that the material was safe for domestic use. No one had asked for this. No one wanted it. But Klein understood that authority flows toward whoever holds the paper, and if the paper said inspected, then the man who stamped it controlled the method. Deputy Bell, still recovering at the claim office, refused to enforce any nuisance complaint against Orrin Shanty. He said so publicly, standing on the store porch with his hands still bandaged from frostbite. He said that the room he had crawled into during the storm was the warmest shelter in Broken Kettle, and that any man who called it a health hazard had not spent a night dying in the cold. Klein did not argue with Bell. He folded the inspection proposal and put it in his desk, but he did not forget it, and he did not forget the stove note. The weeks after the storm were the deepest expression of the partnership between Orrin and Marit. They worked together daily. Marit brought her scrapers and her bone tools and her jar of rendered fat, and she stayed through the afternoons, improving the shanty's seals, repairing tack holes that had loosened during the storm, and refining techniques that Orrin had invented through desperation and she could improve through experience. She showed him how to make removable panels, hides stretched on light frames of willow branch that could be hung over storage shelves and taken down for cleaning or replacement. The frames were simple, 4 sticks lashed at the corners with rawhide cord, a wet hide tacked across the face, dried overnight, then hung from a peg on the wall. When the hide needed washing or the shelf behind it needed access, the panel lifted off. When it was replaced, the seal returned. It was the difference between a permanent wall and a practical tool, and it came from Marit's years of making things that had to be moved, repaired, and reused in fish camps, where nothing was permanent. She showed him how to treat the worst-smelling hides with a mixture of wood ash and creek sand rubbed into the flesh side before tacking. The ash absorbed fat residue. The sand scoured the membrane. Together they reduced the smell from unbearable to faint, and the faint smell faded to nothing within a week of drying. The treatment added half a day to the preparation of each hide, but it meant the difference between a room that stank and a room that simply smelled of old leather. She showed him how to cut ventilation into a sealed room without defeating the seal. A small rawhide flap near the stovepipe collar, hinged on a single tack that could be opened to let stove fumes escape and closed when the air was clear. The flap was 4 inches square, no larger, and it swung on its tack the way a door swings on a hinge. Open, it let a controlled column of warm air exit near the ceiling. Closed, it lay flat against the hide and was nearly invisible. The ventilation flap was her insistence, and it came from a disagreement that lasted an entire afternoon and changed the way Orrin understood what he had built. Orrin wanted the room sealed completely. No gaps, no movement, every crack covered, every seam bonded, every breath of outside air stopped at the wall. The storm had validated total sealing. The storm had rewarded airtightness. Why would he punch a hole in the thing that had saved his children? Marit said this was dangerous. A stove eats air, she said. If you seal the air out, the stove starves. If the stove starves, it smokes. If it smokes, the children breathe poison. You are not building a coffin, Orrin. You are building a room where people live. Orrin argued that the gaps around the stovepipe collar provided enough draft for the fire. Marit said they did not. She held a candle near the collar and showed him the flame barely moving. The seal around the pipe had tightened as the surrounding hide dried further, and the stove was pulling air from the door crack because it had nowhere else to draw. If the door gasket improved further, and it would because rawhide continued to shrink for weeks after the initial drying, the stove would choke. You solved one problem, Marit said. Now you are creating the next one. A room that holds heat but poisons air is not a room. It is a trap with a warm floor. They argued through the afternoon. Orrin cited the storm night. 6 people, 1 stove, no smoke, no poisoning. Marit cited the physics. The door had been opened twice during the storm, and each opening had given the stove enough fresh air to burn clean for hours. In a sealed room with a sealed door on a calm night, the stove would eat the oxygen faster than the gaps replaced it. Marit won because Marit was right, and because Orrin had learned over the weeks of their partnership that Marit being right was not the same as Orrin being wrong. It was the same as 2 people seeing different parts of the same problem. She saw the air. He saw the wall. The room needed both. The ventilation flap went in that evening. It worked. The stove drew better. The smoke cleared. The room remained sealed against wind, but breathed enough to keep the air clean and the fire fed. It was the kind of correction that saves lives without anyone noticing, and it was the last major improvement Marit made to the shanty. Marit's backstory came out in pieces, the way real histories do, not delivered in a single scene, but scattered across afternoons of shared work. She had crossed from Norway at 17 with a husband who died before they reached Minnesota. She had worked in the Red River fish camps because fish camps hired anyone who could sew, and she could sew anything: canvas, hide, sail, net, wound. She had learned rawhide work from Ojibwe women who traded at the camps, and she had learned the principle of stretched membranes from mending storage covers that kept grain dry through prairie rain. She told Oren that a stretched hide and a sewn sail were the same problem solved with different materials. Both required understanding tension, where force gathered, where it distributed, where it broke. A sail that luffed in the wrong place tore at the seam. A hide that dried unevenly cracked at the stress point. The principle was identical. Do not copy the hide, she told him. Copy the reason. She said this more than once in different contexts until Oren understood that she was not teaching him a method. She was teaching him a way of thinking about materials, about force, about the relationship between a surface and the pressure it was asked to hold. She was also dying. The cold and wet of the week spent moving between houses, Oren's shanty, the schoolhouse, Torvik's sod house, Hester Goss's leaking cabin had settled into her lungs. She coughed at first in the mornings, then through the afternoons, then at night, a deep rattling cough that sounded like something tearing inside her chest. Oren told her to rest. She told him there was work. He told her the work could wait. She said the cold could not. The measles arrived in Broken Kettle in late February, carried by a freighter's boy who had passed through a settlement near the rail spur where 6 children were already sick. Within a week, 4 children in Broken Kettle had the fever. Within 2 weeks, the number was 6. The symptoms were familiar to every parent on the frontier. High fever, cough, the rash that spread from face to chest to limbs. Most children survived. Some did not. The difference mothers knew was warmth and steady air. A feverish child in a cold, drafty room worsened. The body spent its energy fighting the chill instead of the sickness. A feverish child in a warm, steady room had a chance. Not a guarantee, a chance. The schoolhouse cloakroom was the obvious choice for a sick room, central, accessible, large enough for 6 cots if they were pushed close together. But the cloakroom had the same problems as every other building in Broken Kettle. Gaps in the plank walls where green boards had warped, a window that did not seat properly in its frame, and a door that let a blade of cold air across the floor every time someone entered. On a calm day, the cloakroom was chilly. On a windy day, it was a draft tunnel. On a storm day, it was useless. Oren and Marit converted the cloakroom in 2 days. This time, Oren led. He had sealed 1 room under desperation and a second under Marit's guidance. Now he was sealing a 3rd under his own judgment, and the stakes were not his children, but other people's children, which carried a weight that was different but no lighter. He walked the cloakroom with the candle on the first morning. The flame bent at 9 points, 2 on the north wall where the boards had separated, 3 around the window frame, 2 along the baseboard where the sill met the foundation, 1 at the door jamb, and 1 at the ceiling where the roof beam had shifted and opened a gap wide enough to pass a pencil through. 9 leaks, 9 paths for cold air to find a feverish child. He sealed them in order of severity. The window frame first, because it was the largest single opening and faced the prevailing wind. He used cowhide bands, thicker than deer hide, harder to work, but available because a farmer named Solheim had butchered a steer the previous week and donated the hide when he heard about the sick room. The cowhide bands went around the frame in overlapping strips, soaked and tacked, pulled tight against the sash. The window stopped breathing within 3 hours. The north wall received canvas backed with flour paste, not as effective as rawhide, but faster to apply and adequate for a wall that faced away from the wind. Oren mixed the paste in a bucket, brushed it onto the canvas with a rag, and pressed the fabric against the plank. The paste froze slightly before bonding, and he had to warm sections with a heated iron to get the adhesion to hold. By afternoon, the canvas was stiff, and the candle stood still along the north face. The baseboard gaps were the hardest. The sill was frozen to the ground, and the gap between sill and plank changed width as the temperature shifted, wider in the cold, narrower in the warmth. A rigid seal would crack when the gap opened. Orrin used twisted rawhide cord, soaked until soft, pressed into the gap, and left to freeze in place. The frozen cord expanded to fill the space. When the temperature rose, the cord would thaw and soften, but by then it would have dried enough to hold its shape. It was imperfect. It was enough. Marit worked beside him on the first day, scraping cowhide edges and cutting gasket strips for the door. On the second day, she sat on a chair near the schoolhouse stove and directed from there, her voice thin, her hands steady when she held a scraper but trembling when she set it down. Her cough had worsened through the night. The sound of it filled the cloakroom between instructions, a wet, rattling hack that came from deeper than her throat and left her gripping the chair arms until her knuckles went white. "The north corner," she said. "The plank is bowed. Use a doubled strip." Orrin used a doubled strip. The corner sealed. "The stove collar needs a flap," she said. "The same as yours, otherwise they will smoke the children." Orrin cut a flap from a piece of elk scrap and tacked it to a hinge point near the collar. It opened and closed with a finger's pressure. He tested the stove with the flap open and the flap closed. Open. The fire drew cleanly, smoke rising straight up the pipe. Closed. The draft slowed, but the room held its heat. The mothers could adjust it through the night, open for fresh air, closed for warmth, without leaving the children's side. "Good," Marit said. She coughed again, and this time the cough took something from her that did not come back. 6 feverish children moved into the cloakroom on a Thursday. The room held heat with a single stove load through the night. The air was steady. The candle stood straight on the shelf. Mothers took shifts sitting with the children, rotating every 4 hours, and none of them burned furniture, and none of them ran out of wood, and none of the children worsened from cold. 2 of the children, both Hester Gosses, turned the corner of the fever within 3 days. Hester sat beside their cots through the worst night, and later told Orrin that the cloakroom was warmer than her own cabin and quieter than any room she had slept in during a winter storm. A 3rd child, the doll girl, held the fever for a week. Her mother sat with her through 6 nights. On the 7th morning, the girl asked for water, and her mother wept into the cup before handing it to her. The room had not saved the girl. The girl's body had saved the girl. But the room had given the body a chance to work without fighting the cold, and the chance had been enough. Marit did not see the sick room completed. She collapsed on the walk home from the schoolhouse on the 2nd day and was carried to her cabin by Lavinia and Orrin. Her cough had deepened into something that did not sound like coughing anymore. It sounded like drowning on dry land. She refused to stay in bed until Orrin told her the cloakroom was finished. He described the sealed walls, the ventilation flap, the doubled strip in the north corner. She asked about the candle. He told her the flame stood straight. "Good," she said. And then she closed her eyes and slept for 14 hours. Marit Bricka died on the 6th of March, 1888, quietly, in her sod-roofed cabin with Tessa sitting beside the bed holding a mended glove that Marit had sewn for her 2 weeks earlier. The stitching on the glove was tight and even and precise, the kind of stitching that only hands with 40 years of practice could produce. Tessa held the glove against her cheek and did not cry because she was 6 and did not yet understand that the hands that made the glove would not make anything else. Orrin stood outside Marit's cabin in the March wind and listened to the schoolhouse cloakroom hum softly in a gust. The sound carried across the frozen yard. That low drum note, the vibration of stretched hide holding against moving air. He had heard it before in his own shanty during the storm. It had frightened him then. It did not frighten him now. It sounded like work that remains after the hands that made it are gone. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is often built in small, unglamorous repairs. Klene filed his claim on the 12th of March. The paper was simple. It stated that Orenvale owed $28 on a stove note held by Rufus Klene, that payment was due before first thaw, and that in the event of non-payment, Klene was entitled to seize the stove and any attached improvements, including, the filing specified, wall coverings of any material affixed to the interior structure. The language was precise. Klene had not written it himself. He had paid a clerk in the rail spur town to draft the notice using language from territorial property statutes, and the clerk had earned his fee by making the seizure sound reasonable, legal, and inevitable. The filing did not mention children. It did not mention the storm. It did not mention the 6 feverish children in the schoolhouse cloakroom. It mentioned debt, property, and the calendar. The claim was legal. The note was real. The debt was unpaid. Klene had waded through the storm, through the validation, through the spread of the method, through the measles crisis and the schoolhouse sick room, and now he moved, not because the timing was cruel, but because the timing was strategic. The community owed Oren gratitude. Gratitude, Klene understood, was a feeling. Debt was a fact, and facts outlasted feelings in territorial law. Teague heard about the filing and came to Oren's shanty that evening. He stood inside the room he had once called lumber, standing upright, and looked at the walls that had survived a storm his own cabin could not match. The stove burned low. Tessa slept near the west wall with her hand against the hide, the way a child sleeps with her hand against something she trusts. "He means to strip them," Teague said. Oren knew. "If he strips those walls in winter, the children will be exposed," Teague said. "The room returns to what it was, a sieve." Oren knew this too. He had thought about it through the day, turning the numbers over the way he turned the scraper in his hand, searching for an angle, a weakness, a way through. $28. He had earned $4 trapping since the storm. He had spent $2 on cornmeal and lard. He had less than $6 in the tobacco tin. The arithmetic had not changed. The arithmetic never changed. It only waited. Teague sat on the bench and rubbed his knees. He was 61 and had built things for 40 years and had never seen a building dispute that was really about a building. This was about land. This was about a claim that had gone from worthless to valuable because one man had done something no one expected with materials no one wanted. "I will not help him remove them," Teague said. "And I will say publicly that stripping those walls in winter endangers children. Bell will not enforce it, but the note is real, Oren. $28 is $28. Oren looked at the walls. The west wall, where the first hide had gone up, the hide from the winter-killed doe, the hide that had taught him the principle, was darker than the others now, harder, cracked faintly at the corners where the wood had shifted beneath it. It was the oldest wall and the most proven, and Klene wanted to peel it off and sell the plank beneath it. The storm was survived. The method was proven. The mentor was dead. The children were alive. The sick room hummed in the wind. And the man who had tried to starve Oren of tax now held a paper that could strip the walls bare and leave 2 children sleeping in a sieve. Spring came to the Dakota Territory the way it always came, not as a gift, but as a negotiation between the cold that held the ground and the sun that wanted it back. The first thaw arrived in late March. The creek ice thinned and broke. Water ran brown along the banks and pooled in low ground where the frost had not yet surrendered. The mud came next, deep, sucking, heavy enough to trap a boot and hold it, and the mud brought the wind because spring wind on the plains had nothing to slow it and nothing to stop it, and it carried rain and grit and the kind of cold that was not winter cold but was cold enough to remind everyone that the season had not entirely let go. Orrin watched the thaw and counted days. Klene's note said payment before first thaw. The first thaw was here. $28 was still $28, and Orrin still had less than $7. But Klene did not come. The reason was water. The spring melt, combined with 3 days of rain that arrived on a southwest wind, swelled the creek beyond its banks. The water rose 2 feet in a single night and spread across the low ground behind the store. Klene's storehouse, a plank-built shed attached to the rear of the main building, where he kept flour, salt, seed, and dry goods, sat on the lowest ground in Broken Kettle. The foundation was 2 courses of field stone set without mortar. The rear sill had rotted the previous summer and had not been replaced because Klene did not believe in spending money on things that were not yet broken. The water came through the rear sill at 3 in the morning. By dawn, 4 inches of brown creek water stood on the storehouse floor. Flour sacks on the bottom tier turned to paste. Salt dissolved. Seed bags wicked the water upward through the burlap until the grain swelled and split the stitching. The loading door, the same door that had frozen open during the ice storm, the same door sealed with blankets and rags, leaked at every joint, and the wind drove rain through the gaps and sheets. Klene stood in his storehouse at sunrise and watched the water climb the flour barrels. He had built a store. He had not sealed it. He had sold tacks and felt paper and battens to every homesteader in the valley, and he had never applied the same logic to his own building, because his building was larger and therefore, in his mind, stronger. It was not stronger. It was larger and weaker, and the water proved it the way the ice storm had proved it, by finding every gap and entering without permission. The men who came to help salvage goods came from the same homesteads Klene had sold supplies to for 3 years. They came because the store was the settlement's only source of flour, salt, ammunition, and mail, and if the store failed, every family suffered. They did not come because they liked Klene. They came with methods they had learned from Orrin. Torvik brought strips of cowhide and tacked them along the rear sill where the water entered, creating a dam that was not watertight but slowed the flow enough to keep up with bucketing. Hester Goss sealed the loading door with canvas and flour paste the way Orrin had sealed the schoolhouse window, pressed flat, smoothed against the plank, left to stiffen. The doll boy, 12 years old, walked the storehouse walls with a candle and marked every air leak with chalk, because the wind was driving rain through the same gaps that had let cold through in January. They did not ask Klene's permission. They worked as though the storehouse belonged to the settlement, because in a practical sense it did. The flour inside fed every family. The salt preserved every household's meat. The seed would go into every field in April. Klene's store was Klene's property, but the contents were the community's survival. And the community sealed the building the way Orrin had sealed his shanty, by finding where the air moved and stopping it. Orrin arrived at mid-morning. He did not speak to Klene. He examined the rear sill, where the rawhide strips had slowed the water but not stopped it, and he showed Torvik how to layer a second strip behind the first, with an overlap that created a channel. The water hit the outer strip, ran down to the floor, and was caught by the inner strip before it could spread. It was not a permanent fix. It was a principle applied to a new problem, and the principle worked because moving water and moving air obeyed the same logic. Find the gap, enter the gap, and ruin everything behind it. He moved to the loading door next. Hester's canvas patch had stopped the wind-driven rain, but the door itself sat crooked in its frame. The hinges had loosened over the winter, and the bottom edge no longer met the sill. Orrin cut a rawhide gasket strip, soaked it in creek water, and tacked it along the bottom edge of the door. The strip would swell as it dried and press against the sill, creating a seal that flexed when the door opened and closed, but held tight when the door was shut. He had done this before. He had done it in the dark, in a storm, with a child dying near the stove and the wind trying to tear the gasket from his hands. Doing it in daylight, in a storehouse, with flour barrels instead of children, felt like work instead of survival. The technique was the same. The fear was not. Klene watched from inside the store. He watched Orrin cut the gasket. He watched Orrin tack it with the staggered method Merritt had taught. One corner, then the diagonal, then the fill. He watched Orrin test the door by closing it and pressing his palm against the bottom edge, feeling for air movement. No movement. The gasket held. Klene said nothing while Orrin worked. He said nothing when Orrin finished. He stood behind his counter with his arms folded and his face composed into an expression that might have been gratitude or might have been the particular shame of a man watching his own building saved by the person he had tried to destroy. By afternoon, the storehouse was drained. The rear sill was sealed with rawhide and canvas. The loading door was tight enough that the wind no longer drove rain through the joints, and the surviving goods had been elevated on plank platforms above the waterline. Klene had lost perhaps a third of his flour, half his salt, and most of his seed stock. He had not lost the store. He had not lost it because the same methods he had mocked, obstructed, and tried to weaponize through debt had been applied to his building by people who had learned them from the man he owed $28. He stood in the doorway and looked at the sealed walls. Rawhide strips, canvas patches, chalk marks where a boy had mapped the leaks with a candle, the same methods, the same principle, the same man's thinking, applied by people who had learned it from watching, asking, and trying. Klene came to Orrin's shanty that evening. He came alone. He carried the stove note in his coat pocket, the same coat pocket where it had lived since the day he had shown it to Orrin beside the cracked sheet iron stove 5 months earlier. He stood in the doorway and looked at the walls, the rawhide, dark and hard, and cracked at the corners, humming faintly in the spring wind, and he looked at the stove where Tessa was warming a pan of cornbread, and he looked at Milo, who was sharpening a tack with a file because bent tacks could be straightened and dull tacks could be sharpened, and nothing in this house was wasted. A debt is worth less than a town that remembers who tried to collect it, Klene said. He held out the stove note. Orrin did not take it immediately. He looked at Klene. He looked at the paper. He let the silence hold for long enough that Klene understood this was not gratitude. This was the closing of an account. Say it in front of Bell and Teague, Orrin said. Kline's jaw tightened, but he nodded. The next afternoon, on the store porch, with Bell and Teague and Lavinia and 11 other settlers present, Klene returned the stove note and stated that Orrin Vale's claim was clear of all debts held by the store. He did not apologize. He did not praise the method. He did not praise the method. He did not call Orrin a good man or a clever one. He said the claim was clear, and he said it loudly enough that everyone heard, and then he went inside and closed the door. It was not redemption. It was not friendship. It was the smallest concession a proud man could make without calling it a concession, and it was enough. The town did not need Klene to become good. The town needed Klene to become honest, and honesty had been forced on him by water, by a rotted sill, and by a community that had sealed his storehouse using methods he had spent 5 months trying to kill. The education had been expensive. The lesson had been earned. Teague, standing beside the porch rail, said quietly to Bell, "That is the most expensive thing Klene has ever given away for free." Bell, whose hand still bore the white scars of frostbite from the night he had crawled to Orrin's woodpile and been dragged inside, said nothing. He folded his arms and watched Kline's door close, and then he walked home through the mud, carrying the particular silence of a man who has survived something and does not need to talk about it. Lavinia Pike did not arrive in Orrin's life the way women arrived in stories told later around stoves and supper tables, suddenly, romantically, as a reward for suffering. She arrived the way a second wall arrives beside the first, through proximity, shared labor, and the slow recognition that the structure was stronger with both. She had been there from the beginning. She had called him mad. She had brought the coffee tin of mismatched tacks. She had sat inside his room during the storm and rubbed Eli's frozen hands. She had carried Marit to her cabin. She had organized the children's nail-collecting crew. She had asked the right questions about overlap and stove distance and gasket material, and she had listened to the answers with the focused attention of a woman who intended to use them. Their courtship, if it could be called that, and Orrin would not have called it that, happened in the margins of work. A shared meal after a day of sealing Torvik's sod house. A conversation about the schoolhouse sick room that lasted past dark, because neither of them moved to end it. A morning when Lavinia arrived with 2 boys and a bucket of creek sand and spent 3 hours helping Orrin treat hides with the ash mixture Marit had taught him. And when the work was done, she sat on the bench and said, "Marit told me once that you were the first man she had met in Dakota who treated a hide like it mattered." Orrin looked at the west wall. The first hide, the winter-killed doe, the one that had started everything, was darker than the others now, almost black at the edges, hard as horn, where the months of heat cycles had baked the protein into something closer to wood than skin. "It did matter," he said. "She did not mean the hide," Lavinia said. There was a moment in April, 3 weeks after Klene returned the note, when Orrin came home from Hester Goss's cabin. He had been patching a loft seam that had opened during the thaw, and found Lavinia sitting at his table with Tessa, teaching the girl how to hem a skirt, using a stitch Lavinia's own mother had taught her. Milo and Lavinia's 2 boys were outside, splitting kindling together with the easy cooperation of children who have stopped counting whose father owns the axe. The stove was warm. The room smelled of cornbread and rendered fat and the faint leather and ash scent of old rawhide. Orrin stood in the doorway. He had been standing in doorways for 6 months, arriving, departing, letting cold air in, sealing it out. This time he stood in the doorway because the room looked like something he had forgotten existed. It looked like a home with people in it who had chosen to be there. Lavinia looked up. "Close the door," she said. "You are letting the wind in." He closed the door. The gasket compressed against the frame. The candle did not bend. There was another moment, quieter, weeks later. Orrin had been scraping hides all day, preparing a set of gasket strips for a family near the creek whose cabin flooded every spring, and his thumb had cracked along the old scar from the storm night, the cut where the bent tack had sliced him while he drove fasteners into the door seam, with Eli dying near the stove. The scar had healed white and ridged, but the skin around it split in dry weather, and the blood that came was slow and thin, like a debt that never quite closed. Lavinia washed the blood from his thumb with warm water from the kettle. She wrapped it in a strip of clean muslin. She did not say anything about the storm or the scar or the night they had spent together in a room that hummed like a drum. She wrapped the thumb and tied the muslin, and then she held his hand for a moment longer than the bandaging required. And that was the moment Orrin understood that the loneliness he had carried since Clara's grave beside the stage road was being replaced by something that did not need to be named in order to be real. They married in the spring of 1890, 2 years after the storm. The ceremony was at the schoolhouse, in the cloakroom that Orrin and Marit had sealed, with the rawhide strips still on the walls and the ventilation flap still hinged near the stovepipe collar. Teague stood as witness. Bell signed the register. Tessa wore the mended glove Marit had sewn, because she had decided it was the most beautiful thing she owned, and she intended to wear it at every important occasion for the rest of her life. Lavinia moved into the shanty with her 2 boys, and the shanty became something it had never been, crowded in a way that was not desperate but chosen, 5 people in 12 by 16 feet. The rawhide walls held. The stove burned steady. The ventilation flap opened and closed with the rhythm of a household that understood air the way other households understood firewood, as something that could be managed, directed, and used. The years compressed the way years do when work replaces crisis and routine replaces survival. Orrin taught, not in the schoolhouse, and not from a book, but from the bench beside his stove, and from the walls of other people's homes. He taught Milo first. The boy learned to read a candle flame the way other boys learned to read animal tracks, as a map of invisible movement. A bent flame meant a leak. A steady flame meant a seal. A flickering flame meant a gap too small to see but large enough to steal heat. Milo grew into the work the way a tree grows into the shape of the wind that pushes it, gradually, inevitably, until the shape and the force became the same thing. By 15, he could seal a room faster than Orrin. By 17, he was building frames, not just hiding walls, but constructing the walls themselves with battens set tight and rawhide gaskets pre-fitted before the plank went up. He became a carpenter who thought like a skinner, which is to say he thought about surfaces and tension and the places where force gathers when it has nowhere else to go. Teague took him on as an apprentice the summer he turned 16, and the old carpenter later said that Milo built tighter corners than any man he had trained, because Milo had grown up in a room where a loose corner meant a cold child and a bent candle flame meant someone had made a mistake. Milo's first solo commission was a cabin for a family named Solheim, who had settled 2 miles east of Broken Kettle. He built it in September, before the first frost, and he sealed every seam before the walls went up, gaskets in the door frame, rawhide strips behind the corner battens, a ventilation flap near the stovepipe collar installed on the day the collar was fitted. Teague inspected the finished cabin and walked the perimeter with a candle. The flame did not bend at any point along any wall. Teague said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your father would need 3 hides to seal a room I cannot find a leak in." It was the highest compliment Teague had ever given, and he gave it without smiling, because Teague did not smile at good work. He simply acknowledged it and moved on. Tessa learned differently. She learned from Marit's absence, from the tools left behind, the scrapers and the curved blade, and the coil of rawhide cord thin enough to thread through an awl-hole. She learned to sew the way Marit had sewn, with the patience of a woman who understood that a stitch was not a decoration, but a bond between 2 pieces of material that needed to hold against force. She kept Marit's awl in a leather case she had made herself, and used it to punch holes in hides, canvas, and later leather goods that she sold at the store and at the rail spur market. She did not become a builder. She became a mender, the person people brought things to when the things were broken and needed to be whole again. Boots, harness, saddlebags, trunk straps, and once a rawhide wall panel that had cracked during a hard freeze and needed a patch that would hold without tacks. She stitched it with rawhide cord using a cross-stitch pattern Marit had shown her for mending sailcloth, and the patch held for 4 winters without loosening. Lavinia's contribution was organization. She insisted that the teaching be written down because, as she told Orrin more than once, memory dies with people. Marit had died. Marit's knowledge had nearly died with her. Only the fact that Orrin had worked beside her long enough to absorb her methods had preserved them, and Orrin would not live forever, and his hands would not always be steady, and his eyes would not always see the candle bend. She started the wind book. It was a ledger, bound in hide, because of course it was, kept at the store but not owned by Klene. Lavinia had negotiated its placement with the quiet authority of a woman who understood that knowledge left in one house served one family, but knowledge left in the store served everyone. Klene had objected. Lavinia had reminded him that his storehouse was standing because of what was in that book. Klene had stopped objecting. The Winnabook listed seam fixes, rawhide bands for plank walls, canvas backing for sod, twisted cord for baseboard gaps, gasket strips for doors and windows, ventilation flaps for sealed rooms, stove distance rules for drying hides, the ash and sand treatment for reducing smell, and the pole brace method for hanging ceiling strips without standing on a stove. It listed how much wood each household burned before and after repairs, Teague's figures, precise and unforgiving, showing reductions of 1/3 to 1/2 in fuel consumption for properly sealed rooms. It listed failures, too. Hides that had rotted because the scraping was incomplete, gaskets that had torn because the tacks were too far apart, a canvas patch that had mildewed because the flour paste was mixed too wet. The failures were as valuable as the successes because they taught people what not to do, and knowing what not to do was half of knowing anything. The Win book grew. Families added their own notes in pencil, in ink, in charcoal, when nothing else was available. Torvik wrote about sealing sod walls with canvas and clay, noting that the clay worked best when mixed with animal hair for binding. Hester Goss wrote about the candle and chalk method for teaching children to find leaks, and she included a diagram drawn by her eldest son showing a hand holding a candle near a wall with arrows indicating the direction of the flame's bend. The Dahl family wrote about using heavy muslin soaked in linseed oil as a substitute for rawhide in rooms where the smell was unacceptable, and they noted that linseed muslin lasted 1 season before it needed replacement, while rawhide lasted 3 or more. Each entry was practical, specific, and grounded in the experience of someone who had tried it in their own home and measured the result. By the second winter after the storm, more than 40 cabins, sheds, pantries, and sick rooms around Broken Kettle used some version of the air sealing method. Not all used rawhide. Some used canvas, clay, felt, or battens. The very battens Teague had prescribed in his original assessment of orange shanty, now applied not as a substitute for rawhide, but alongside it, because people had learned that different materials served different gaps, and the best room used whatever stopped the air at each specific point. The schoolhouse children learned the candle test as a standard exercise. They walked the walls with the flame, marked the leaks with chalk, and reported to their parents. It became ordinary. It became the kind of knowledge that children absorb without knowing they are learning, the way farm children learn weather signs and river children learn currents. And within a generation, it was simply part of how people in that part of the territory thought about winter. Not a miracle, not a revolution, just a thing that people did because it worked. The way people banked fires at night and stacked wood with the bark facing up. Orrin never became wealthy. The claim produced enough for a family, but not a fortune. The shanty gained a proper addition in 1892, a second room, plank-built, sealed by Milo using battens and rawhide gaskets from the start. The original room remained. The rawhide walls stayed. Lavinia had suggested once in the early months of their marriage that the old hides might be replaced with proper felt paper and battens now that they could afford them. Orrin had looked at the west wall, the first hide, the winter-killed doe, and said nothing. Lavinia had understood the silence and never suggested it again. He and Lavinia raised 4 children between them, his 2, her 2, and later, in the small addition, a daughter born in 1893 whom they named Martha, after Orrin's mother, the woman who had stretched a wet hide across a smokehouse door in Missouri and taught a boy that skin remembers being smaller. Martha grew up in a room where the walls hummed in the wind, and she thought this was how all houses sounded. And when she visited other homes and the walls were silent, she felt uneasy, as though the house were holding its breath. The years had a rhythm that the first winter had not allowed, planting in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn, sealing in the weeks before the freeze. Every October, Orrin walked the cabins of neighbors who asked and some who did not, checking gaskets, testing seams, marking leaks with the same charcoal scratches the children used. He charged nothing. Lavinia said he should charge something because labor has value and knowledge has more. Orrin said a man who charges for candle flame and common sense is a man who has forgotten what it felt like to sit in a room where the wind came through the walls and there was no one to ask. Orrin became the man people called before the first hard freeze. Not because he had a title, not because he charged a fee, because he knew which wall would leak and which would hold, and because he would walk a stranger's cabin with a candle and mark the faults without being asked and without judgment. He had lived in a sieve. He knew what it felt like to feed a fire that the wind consumed faster than the wood could burn. He did not lecture people who lived in sieves. He helped them stop the wind. The work changed him in ways that were visible only to the people who had known him in the first months at Broken Kettle. The desperation left. The urgency remained. He still moved with the economy of a man who understands that materials are finite and time is shorter, but the fear behind the economy had been replaced by something steadier. Lavinia called it patience. Teague called it competence. Milo, who knew his father better than either of them, called it nothing. He simply noticed that his father's hands no longer shook when he held a tack, and that his father slept through the night without waking to check the stove, and that his father could hear the wind hit the walls without flinching. He never let people call the rawhide room a miracle. When anyone used the word, and they used it, especially newcomers who heard the story secondhand and arrived at the shanty expecting to see something extraordinary, he corrected them. It was not a miracle. It was a lesson learned from skin, wind, and poverty. His mother had taught him half of it. Marit had taught him the other half. The storm had tested it. The testing was the only part he could take credit for, and the testing had been done because he had no other choice. A man with money would have bought battens, he told a settler from Minnesota who had asked to see the famous walls. A man with help would have hired carpenters. I had neither. I had a dead deer and a memory of my mother's hands. That is not a miracle. That is what happens when everything else is gone. In his later years, when his hands had stiffened and his eyes had dulled and the scraper sat on the shelf more than it sat in his palm, he still walked the shanty each autumn with a candle. The first West wallhide, the winter-killed doe from the coulee, was black and hard and cracked at every corner, and it no longer hummed in the wind because the wood behind it had settled and swelled and sealed itself over the decades. But Orrin checked it anyway. He held the candle an inch from the surface and waited. The flame stood still. It always stood still. He checked it anyway. He died in the early winter of 1904 after a short illness that settled in his chest the way Marit's had settled in hers. Quietly, patiently, without drama or spectacle, the way the cold enters a room through a gap too small to see. Milo was repairing the door. The same leather hinges replaced twice, the same rawhide gasket replaced 4 times, when Orrin closed his eyes for the last time. Tessa sat beside the stove holding the mended glove in her lap, the stitching still tight after 16 years, the leather softened by 1,000 wearings. Lavinia held his hand. The stove burned low. The walls held. The candle on the shelf did not bend. By the 3rd winter after the storm, more than 40 buildings around Broken Kettle used some version of the sealing method Orrin and Marit had built from necessity and refined through labor. The school children tested walls with candles and marked leaks with chalk, the way they tested arithmetic and marked errors with pencil. One detail had spread further than any other. The ventilation flap, Marit's insistence, her correction of Orrin's impulse to seal everything shut. It hung near stovepipe collars across the settlement, a 4-inch square of rawhide on a single tack, and it saved more lives than the walls themselves, because it kept the air breathable while the walls kept it warm. Orrin lived out his years on the same claim Klene had tried to take. He never removed the first west wall hide. It darkened, hardened, and cracked at the corners, but he left it there because it was the wall that taught the town to listen. He died in a room that smelled faintly of old leather and stove ash, with his son at the door and his daughter at the stove, and the candle standing steady on the shelf where it had stood for 17 years. Rufus Klene had set it on an October afternoon, standing in a room that smelled of blood and tallow, looking at wet hides sagging from tack heads. A man who papers his walls with dead animals has already surrendered to winter. Years later, during another hard blow, a child in the schoolhouse sick room pressed 2 fingers against a rawhide patch and heard it hum, that low, steady note, like something breathing inside the wall. Outside, snow ran flat across the yard, finding nothing to enter, nothing to breach, nothing to ruin. Inside, the candle stood upright. The stove burned low. The air was still. Orrin's old shanty at dusk, its plank walls still rough, its stove small, its west wall hidden beneath stretched hide that once looked like madness and now looked like the only thing between a family and the wind. The town had laughed because the walls looked alive, and that winter they were.